of the Bud Shorstein Center for Jewish Studies. I'm delighted to see you all here this evening for this very special event, which is being co-sponsored by the Shorstein Center for Jewish Studies and the Hamilton Center as well. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce my friend Jeremy Black. Jeremy Black is the author of over 180 books. You heard me, the author of over 180 books. In fact, this is the clone of Jeremy Black. He's not... Yes, a hologram. He was described in 2004 as, quote, the most prolific historical scholar of our age. And to say that his interests are broad is a vast understatement. He's written books on everything from British military history to the British Empire to the Atlantic slave trade and world history to the history of the railroad to tank warfare to naval warfare to rethinking World War II. He has written on the historical context of James Bond and the world of Sherlock Holmes, and our office manager and he today were in a deep discussion over his book on Agatha Christie's detective novels. He has been a guest more times than one can count on numerous podcasts, including one of my favorite podcasts, Melvin Bragg's In Our Time, and he is a frequent contributor to important opinion magazines such as The Critic in London. But tonight, I want to focus on his strong interest in the history of Germany and the Holocaust, as well as the history of historical writing itself. This is the context for Jeremy's talk today, because we are living in a moment when the history of the Holocaust, and in particular its Jewish elements, is being challenged from various quarters. I heard at a conference a couple of years ago that the Holocaust has become a hegemonic narrative, and this is the kind of thing that we're struggling against. In short, the Holocaust, which has always been a political issue, has been politicized anew. The title for his talk tonight is It Always Political? The Holocaust in Postwar and Contemporary History. Everyone, please welcome with me Dr. Jeremy Black.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you very much for coming to listen. I know there are many other things to do, so I do appreciate it. I've not spoken on this subject before, and what I'm going to try, in the sense publicly, and what I'm trying to do is to move beyond my book, The Holocaust in History and Memory, which Indiana University Press published, and you can read if you want, or ignore if you want. I don't want to give people what I've already written about. I want to really rethink the question from the perspective of 2025, because, as we are aware, we're in a rapidly changing world, a world in which I think it's fair to say anti-Semitism is on the rise from three particular directions: the far right, the far left, and Islamic communities. Indeed, only yesterday the German elections saw the extreme right, which, sometimes people misuse the term the extreme right. I think that is a very fair description of the German political party involved, which after all rejects Holocaust guilt or responsibility. And that came second and took about a fifth of the electorate. And just to remind you, that was a party publicly endorsed by prominent American politicians within the last 2 weeks, much to the shock of Europe. You don't have to like Europeans. You might think Europeans are foolish, lazy, whatever you want, in decline, but it is nevertheless shocking to hear American senior American politicians bluntly favor Nazi lovers. Now, what I want to try and do is to start by looking at the situation since 1945. I'll go through that fairly rapidly because I've covered it in print. I'm quite happy to expand on it in questions if people want to. And then I want to focus on the last 5 years, because I think one of the important aspects of this foundation and these lectures should be public education. And by public education, I don't mean me telling you what what to think. That would be a naive and arrogant approach. What I mean is us discussing, hopefully including, you responding negatively, if you like, to what I'm saying, the current situation. But let me start, I am a historian after all, let me start with the perspective. And I'm talking about post-45 because the history of the Holocaust in the war is a subject that is much covered by scholars. The scholarship on it is excellent. I don't feel I've got anything particularly new to contribute. I don't think anybody's got anything particularly new to contribute. If you've read my book on the Holocaust, you will know that I emphasise more than is conventional the Einsatzgruppen killings, and correspondingly it's not a book in which the Holocaust simply is about Auschwitz II, terrible as that place was. And I also say more about the role in Jew killing, which is what it was, the role of Germany's allies, Romania, Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, Croatia, and so on. And that's the particular difference. And by emphasising that, of course, I moved attention from it being simply a German matter with the cooperation of some others, and I instead argued that as it were, the ownership of the Holocaust, to use a ludicrous modern phrase, but the ownership of the Holocaust in terms of the initiators was much more widespread, and therefore we shouldn't just be looking for factors in the German pathology, but we needed to be considering the pathology of others, as I said, Croats, Romanians, and so on. But I want to instead focus on the post-1945 situation. Now, I think it's fair to say, this is going to surprise most people, but I think it's fair to say that in most countries, the period after 1945 till, and it varied by country, it was generally till the 1970s, in some countries till the 80s, and in a few countries till the 90s, that period was generally one in which the Holocaust was minimised and in part forgotten. It was the practice in many states, for example, in the communist states in Eastern Europe or in France, it was the practice to ignore the heavily disproportionate nature of Jewish casualties among civilians in World War II, and instead to describe, say, if you went to Poland, you would hear that the casualties in Auschwitz were Poles. No mention of the fact that the vast majority, not all of them of course, but that the vast majority were Jewish, and so on and so forth. That was the general stance, not surprising in a way if you know communist ideas about trying to underplay or ignore separate nationalities or separate ethnicities or separate religions within communist states. Not surprising in a sense in France, where the de Gaulle regime wanted to emphasize the idea that all the French were united against Germany, and only a tiny number had cooperated and were not really happy to talk about the Holocaust at all. Not surprising in West Germany, where under Adenauer there was, who was Chancellor right through the 50s into 1963, there was a lengthy period of, as it were, forgetting about World War II and trying to cover up what had happened. Not surprising, you might argue, in the case of the United States or Britain. In both of those countries, there was a vested interest in believing in the idea of good Germans as opposed to bad Germans. I remember when I was growing up, I'm older than I look, I remember when I was growing up, it was very much the idea of, yes, there were bad Germans and they were members of the SS, but the majority of Germans were good Germans. They'd been members of the Wehrmacht, they just fought us, but other than that they were, chaps, as it were. And of course there was a vested interest for the West strategically in that view, because the Bundeswehr, the successor to the Wehrmacht, was from 1955 onwards the principal source of manpower on the inner German frontier, in other words protecting Western Europe for NATO. And on top of that, and this is going to surprise you, this was also a view in Israel. In Israel, the Zionist movement preferred to see Masada as their totemic thing, the idea being that they wanted to emphasize the resistance to the death of the people that had died fighting the Romans on the edge of the Dead Sea. And there was a degree of feeling that those that had stayed behind in Europe and had not been Zionists, had not made the journey in the 30s, I think it's fair to say they didn't have the choice, most of them, but that was not to the forefront, were less impressive. And for a state that was involved in bitter wars of survival against Arab neighbours who would quite happily have carried out genocide on them in 1948-49, in 1956, in 1967, in 1972-3, the memory of Auschwitz or Treblinka or so was an uncomfortable one. You know, why didn't these people fight? They didn't have a choice, I think is the fair answer. But nevertheless, that was very much the Israeli account of those years. So, and the Holocaust was downplayed. I don't mean by that that nobody paid any attention to it, but I think it's fair to say if you look at film, television or publications, there were relatively few books in that period. And it's not surprising that disproportionate attention was devoted to things like the Diary of Anne Frank or Primo Levi's account of his time at Auschwitz. I don't think there's much surprise about that because there were so far fewer episodes. And of course in academic departments, on the whole, there wasn't the specialists working on the Holocaust, and I think it's fair to say that in most academic departments and in most public history, there was really very little attention to it. I mean, I was thinking only today, I had actually forgotten this, that the high school I went to, which had about a third of the population of that school were Jews, the high school I went, because it was in northwest London, the high school I went to actually for the 14-year-olds, there was a sort of course in history on the Third Reich up to 1939, and thinking about it, there was virtually nothing on the treatment of the Jews. Yes, Kristallnacht was mentioned, but it was really about how the Nazis consolidated power, the foreign policy they followed. Those were the principal themes. And I think that would be fairly true to say of most non-specialist treatment of Germany in the 1930s at high school level, or indeed university level, at that period. Now that situation changed, and as I've said, it changes from a variety of dates and for a variety of reasons. So in Eastern Europe, for example, it is the fall of the communists in 1989 that leaves open the possibility of new narratives of history. Some of those narratives, it ought to be said, were anti-Semitic. Some of those narratives were not. But it certainly meant that the communist account was no longer there, or was only of minor importance. In the case of the United States, of France, of Britain, of Israel, Australia, there was a greater consciousness of the Holocaust from the 1970s on, both within Jewish communities and within non-Jewish, the non-Jewish population. Within Jewish communities, historians agree that there had been a process of almost forgetting or desire to forget because of the pursuit of assimilation, which was a very strong thing in particularly the United States and Britain in the late 40s, 50s and 60s. So there's a number of factors that have been argued for, but what certainly is the case is there were television programs about it, documentaries and non-documentaries, there were films, there were more publications, and there was more of a pressure for public commemoration. The countries that this was most pertinent for in Western Europe were West Germany, which of course had been the principal perpetrator, and France, where Vichy had been a loathsome presence which had been sort of somewhat pushed under the carpet. And what was interesting is in each country this interacted with politics. In the case of West Germany, a lot of the pressure for rethinking or thinking about, or at least acknowledging the Holocaust, came from a generational clash, a reaction from the late 60s on against the CDU dominance by Adenauer, and Adenauer had been succeeded by Erhard from 63 to 66. You then move towards a German politics in which the SPD is more prominent, and the SPD in particular is willing to downplay the CDU's narrative. The CDU had very much focused in recalling World War II on the German refugees, several million of them, that had been pushed out of Eastern Europe. And indeed, the refugees had produced a number of fairly poisonous right-wing, far right-wing political movements linked to the CDU, and which did quite well in the elections. These become much less prominent from the late 60s, and you get in West Germany a generational attack of the young on their parents. You know, what did you do in the war? Which is part, of course, of the generation of 68. And you also get the change of government. You get Willy Brandt, who had spent the war having fled Germany, whereas a lot of the CDU prominent people had actually served in the German government. Adenauer's chief of staff had been quite a senior Nazi involved in Holocaust planning, and that completely goes with the SPD. And of course, Brandt very publicly goes to Warsaw, apologizes for the Warsaw Ghetto, changes the tone of German politics, I think, as far as the Holocaust is concerned. I think that's very fair comment to make. And Holocaust denial, which of course had been a pathology of the far right, I would describe it as mad, were that not a calumny on the insane, all right? I mean, Holocaust denial is just disgusting. But Holocaust denial, which had been a pathology of the far right, becomes something that is unacceptable in the Federal Republic, in West Germany. The case of France, again, politics was important. The Gaullists had this narrative that all of the French were really members of the resistance, apart from a tiny number. And that was a very useful way, de Gaulle thought, to try and reintegrate the French after the war. And that went on under his two successors, Pompidou and Giscard d'Estaing. In 1981, very differently in its political trajectory to what was happening what had happened in West Germany, a socialist came to power. Anybody tell me who that was? Well done. I'm just trying to wake you up, okay? François Mitterrand came to power. And François Mitterrand, of course, was a socialist. But Mitterrand himself had had an ambivalent war, which I think is a polite way to describe it, and including, shall we say, episodes when he could be presented as being, shall we say, a Vichyist. And he certainly had prominent friends who had been members of the Vichy system, including people who were subsequently to be tried for offences linked to the deportation of Jews to slaughter. Now, under Mitterrand, the Holocaust became high octane in French public debate. You have, first of all, the rise of the Front National under Jean-Pierre Le Pen, who was a Holocaust denier, said that the Holocaust was just a detail of history, etc., etc. Mitterrand deliberately altered the electoral rules, helped the Front National because he wanted to weaken the Gaullists. In turn, the Gaullists had changed their policy, the key figure being Jacques Chirac, who had no skin in the game. I mean, he was from a farming community in the Corrèze region, but he, as first mayor of Paris, and then in effect as leader of the opposition to Mitterrand, pressed very hard on the issue of Vichy cooperation with the Germans, and on the issue of French role in the Holocaust. And indeed, I can remember I first went to France on an archival trip to do research in 1979. And I can remember and then I went regularly. I wrote quite a lot on French history, French foreign policy, based on the archives. And I can remember the changes that occurred in Paris when you would start to, and the mayor has a lot of power in Paris, it's not an honorific position, when you would start to see on schools, you know, from this school, 63 children, all Jewish, were taken away to be killed such and such a date. And, you know, proclamations from the mayor attacking the legacy of Vichy and attacking Mitterrand, who he said was covering up for Vichyists. And that was taken much more forward in France after Mitterrand went and Chirac took over. And Holocaust memorialization became much, much stronger and was continued by Sarkozy. So by the 2000s, I think it's 2000s and teens, I think it's fair to say that in the West, however understood geographically, I'm not quite sure on what basis New Zealand is seen geographically as the West, but you know what I mean. And the West, as far as the West was concerned, there was a widespread memorialization of the Holocaust. Country after country had Holocaust Day. Country after country insisted that in its education there should be, you know, consequential mention of the Holocaust. I can give you a personal indication of this. In the early 2010s, the British revised the national curriculum. The national curriculum, in other words, what state schools were supposed to teach in history, had been introduced by the Conservatives in the 1980s. The government of Mrs. Thatcher, the Secretary of State for Education, Kenneth Baker, had introduced it. And in the early 2010s, they decided to revise it. And they appointed a committee, the endless British habit of committee speaking under committee. They appointed a committee in order to draw up a new curriculum. And I know a bit about that because I was on the committee. And the question was how, in only so much time, because the government didn't propose to provide more time for history, how were we going to change it? And interestingly enough, I knew the Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove, and he said to me that history was the subject in which Secretaries of State of Education, that's the minister, Secretaries of State received the most complaints from members of the public. He said nobody seems to care about what is put in chemistry courses, but everybody seems to have a view of history. He said English literature was second. Anyway, the committee decided, and I think it's fair to say, I mean, the Secretary of State came along to quite a few of the meetings in person. He was interested in it. They were doing at the same time other subjects, but nobody cared about the other subjects and they were never written about. The committee decided that what it was going to do in response to the changing nature of the world, rise of China and so on, was to downplay the extent to which European history was covered in the national curriculum, sustain the same level of British history, but increase the amount of non-European history. I think it's fair to say I was one of the few open conservatives in British academia. I think it's fair to say that I was, as it were, taking instruction. The Secretary of State said to me, whatever happens, the compulsory component on the Holocaust has to be maintained. And indeed, that's what happened. So the only thing that it was compulsory to teach in the national curriculum was the Holocaust. And I think that's a fair description of where a lot of countries in the West were. The principal difference was what you might call the new West, i.e. Eastern Europe, countries like Romania, Ukraine in fact, in which the nationalists, the anti-communists who had come forward into power from the 1990s had a very variable fix on their wartime situation. So, for example, in Romania, the dictator of Romania, there was a king, but it was a dictatorship under Marshal Antonescu. He was the dictator. The Romanians had slaughtered a lot of Jews, principally in what used to be called Bessarabia. We would now call it Moldova, and also when they took over the city of Odessa. They'd killed a very large number. And in 1946, the communists shot Antonescu, and Antonescu became a non-person. Well, suddenly in the 1990s and 2000s, sort of Antonescu boulevards and statues started sprouting up because he was held up to be an anti-communist, and this was a good thing. Same thing with Tiso in Slovakia, same thing in Croatia. On the other hand, obviously, people who were opposed to this kind of nationalism publicly criticised it. And I think it's fair to say also that the Americans made it absolutely crystal clear to countries like Romania that this was totally unacceptable. So you have the row in the European Union in the 2000s. All of these countries joined not all of them, but most of them joined the European Union. And you have the row about whether there should be an official EU Holocaust Memorial Day. And the Eastern Europeans say, yep, we'll have that, but we also want communist crimes to be equally endorsed. And the Western Europeans, sort of throw up their hands in shock. But the point being that I'm making is that although the Eastern Europeans weren't, shall we say, as far advanced, nevertheless, the debate was very clear. Now the Holocaust was a topic, as opposed to the situation under the communists in these countries where really the Holocaust had been completely ignored. As a result of that, when I did the first edition of my Holocaust in History and Memory, I very much thought I knew where we were at. I did make what might have surprised people, the suggestion that actually in the long term and the short term, Holocaust memorialization would decline, because I pointed out that in both China and India, which were the two most populous countries in the world, there was very little mention in their world history about the Holocaust. Same incidentally with Indonesia, the world's fourth largest population, and the same also with Japan. And I did suggest that as India and China became more prominent, so actually Holocaust memorialization would decline. But I didn't see what was going to happen in Europe. Simply didn't see it. Even I think it's fair to say, by the time the second edition came out, I still was aware that anti-Semitism was on the increase. One would be an idiot not to be aware of that, and that part of that anti-Semitism included discussion of what I call Holocaust diminishment. I think that's what I would argue you get. You do get some people who have a pathology and they are actually deny that the Holocaust happened. But it's more common to have what I call Holocaust diminishment. And by diminishment, I mean you get people saying, oh yes, there was a Holocaust, but equally, there was the slave trade, and there was, the European colonialization here, there, and the other way, and there was the killing of the Armenians. So why on earth is there so much fuss about the Holocaust of the 40s? That was already very present in the 20-teens. But I think it's fair to say it hadn't been politicized to the extent that one is now seeing. Now, the situation now we can look at, we can argue comes from a variety of political, ideological developments. And as I mentioned at the outset, I would see those as the far right, the far left, and Islam. Let's start with the far right. The far right has been increasingly on the rise in Europe over the last decade. And Actually, in some countries earlier than that. But I think it's really the last decade, one would argue. And it drew enormous strength from the Syrian migrant crisis of 2015, the sense that was created of millions of Syrians, refugees from Assad, trying to enter Europe and then trying to move through Europe, and countries like Hungary put in frontier defences, etc., etc., etc. And these helped the far right, which fundamentally benefited from opposition to large-scale immigration and opposition to globalization and what was held to be the implications of that. The far right rose in electoral terms, helped by the decline, relative or absolute, of both the traditional left and of the moderate right, both of which hit problems. And as you've just seen, you see the situation in Germany, you've seen the situation in France, you see the situation in Spain, you see the situation in Italy, etc., etc. Now, in these countries, the prime narrative was not about Jews and the Holocaust. Most of these people were anti-Semites to some extent or another, but that was not the prime narrative. The prime narrative was anti-Islam, but there was also hostility to a kind of what they presented as a history in which they thought they were being unfairly treated. And one of the key elements, particularly seen in Germany, but not only in Germany in this respect, was the Holocaust. And of course, there was the argument, taking something straight out of the playbook of Nazi propagandists of the 1930s, there was the argument that Jews were globalists, that Jews were sort of disruptive modernizers. There was complaints in some countries like Hungary about George Soros, etc., etc. So there was a very hostile approach to Jews. I mean, it's an ironic thing if you think about it, if you think of anti-Semitic rhetoric. Jews in the 30s and still today were attacked both for being too conservative and socially conservative, not integrating, living in communities, wearing long beards and all the rest of it. And they were also attacked for being disruptive modernizers who didn't understand or relish the national community. So, both of those elements are present in anti-Semitic accounts on the far right. On the far left, and the far right didn't tend to be, to the same extent, by any means anti-Israel. They weren't particularly interested, but they didn't tend to be anti-Israel, because they didn't like Arab countries either. In fact, if anything, they loathed Arabs more. Okay? The far left, very different. And when one says the far left, it moves much of the left, not just the far left. The far left, or the left, very different. In those cases, there was hostility towards Israel, which was quite strong. And there was in particular the argument, voiced that Western society was an matter of white privilege, that there needed to be a reconceptualization of the ethnic history and consciousness of imperialism. And from that point of view, Israel was attacked as a alleged presentation of Western imperialism, as a colonial power, and of course was deeply worrying to people that took the approach, because of course you can scarcely say that those people who are victims of the Holocaust are in some way beneficiaries of white privilege. Nevertheless, that was exactly what they did say in some really quite convoluted arguments, okay? Remember, consistency is not what we're looking for here. Lastly, one had Islam. Islam becomes more assertive, I think, as a political, in its political commentary on the West in this period. In part, you see, as you saw on the left, you see a revival of Cold War communist themes, the argument in the Cold War that Israel was a capitalist colonial power had been made by Soviet apologists, and that argument is repurposed and reused. In part, you've got the Islamic population, which is growing in Europe, much but not all of which rejects, as it were, the historical account of the countries that it's in. And, for example, Muslims in Britain don't like any reference to the Holocaust, etc., etc. And in part, there are other societies in which in which Islam is present, in which there is a general hostility to Israel, Jews, and Holocaust themes. So a classic example of that is countries that banned the showing of Schindler's List. Schindler's List, one of the most powerful films in terms of circulation about the Holocaust, was, for example, banned in Malaysia. You just couldn't show it. Or again, to give you a personal thing, last year I was visiting professor at the Indonesian Staff College. Indonesia, the world's 4th largest population, is actually one of the world's largest Islamic countries, far more so than any of the Arab countries. And they picked the topics for me, and in one of the topics I was talking about the Houthis and them firing missiles, and they said to me afterwards, they said, "You can't talk about that, you have to understand we are much more sympathetic to the Houthis." Which I have to say rather did take me aback, but it gives you the kind of scenario we're talking about. And you will not be surprised to hear that in Indonesian schools and universities, the Holocaust just really isn't there. So, I think it's fair to say that separate to, some people argue that it's just October the 7th last year, which is leading to a change of attitudes and assumptions. I think actually it's much more deep-rooted than that. I think it is gathering pace, and I think it is of great consequence because it does mean one needs to think about how one wishes to present the Holocaust. On top of that, there is the general question of what we call the relativization of things. So first of all, we've got as a problem in the West as a whole, and not just the West, let me make this clear, but we're in the West, so let's focus on it. We've got the problem in the West of the whole of the, as it were, the denigration, debauching, weakening of language. So let me give you an instance. Chap I knew, I still know him, Oliver Colville, who was a British MP from 2010 to 2017, he was very worked up about, you have to, this is just ridiculous, but these are the sort of people that become MPs. Obviously America has perfect congressional representatives. He was very worked up about the fate of hedgehogs. Okay, you know what hedgehogs are? Do you use the same word? Yeah. He was very worked up about the fate of hedgehogs, which apparently are doing very badly because of badgers and cars and all the rest of it. And in the House of Commons, he referred to an ongoing Holocaust of hedgehogs. And I rang him up and I said, "That's ridiculous, Oliver." I said, "That is absolutely ridiculous use of language." That's obviously a comic aspect of it, but a more serious one is the issue which I was discussing with Norman last night, the way in which now the term genocide is thrown around very widely to discuss an enormous amount of episodes which clearly were not genocidal. The policies may have been unpleasant. You could argue there were instances after 1945 which were genocidal. You could argue, I suppose, that the Nigerian treatment of the Biafrans, deliberately starving them in the 67-70 war, about 2 million Biafrans died. You could argue, if you like, that was genocidal, but in fact there wasn't an intention to extirpate all Biafrans. There was just an intention of, as it were, using famine in order to get them to give up the war. the separatist war. You can argue that there are some episodes in which there is particular sustained policy in which the killing or death of a large number of people of another group constitutes official policy, but very rarely. And I think it's fair to say, on the other hand, that the term has been used very widely. And what that constitutes, I would argue, is the very diminishment of what I was talking or suggesting earlier. So what is the next point I would like to make? And I am moving towards my conclusion. I'm more concerned about the here and now, and as it were, the imminence of history. By 2030, what's happened between 2025 and 2030 becomes history. So it's what I call the imminence of history. I'm more concerned about that than having a debate about why things may have changed in the 1990s, though I'm more than happy to do that, but do please read the book first, because it's footnoted, so it gives you a chance to see why I say things. What I would suggest, if we're looking at the situation now, is there is a profound change in which, I have to say, it's all too easy for foreigners to come and say things to you, in which the Americans are the absolute key players. America is the world's greatest power. It's also the third most populous state in the world. And I think it's fair to say that if one removes morality as a theme from national history and national interest, if you take morality out, then quite frankly, you lose the basis of arguing that there is any cause through which you can criticize people for slaughtering any particular ethnic, religious, or indeed social group. And I think that's where we are in danger of being. I'm not talking specifically about this administration. I'm talking about a broader issue, which is, does one believe simply in a transactional nature of international relations and of national recollection and of national identity? Because if one does, it's not surprising that the Holocaust will go down the plug hole. It will be remembered by Jews, it will be remembered by academic historians, there will be one or two others that remember it, as it were, somebody saying to an elderly grandfather, why is there those concrete remains down there, and the person saying to them, oh, well, that was a concentration camp called Dachau, and the person saying, well, what was a concentration camp? You could easily see that happening in 20 years' time. And obviously, if we have transactional state policy, that is what we are going to end up with, all right? Now, it's up to you. You're the world's power. It's up to you as to think about how you wish it to be. But the notion that in some way one can simply blame, loathsome and unpleasant as they are, the far right, the far left and Islam, and say, well, actually, it's nothing to do with us if these people want to be unpleasant, is really not very sensible if one is the world's leading power. It just doesn't work like that. Because a lot of times people will only respond to pressure or to being shown up by those who have more power than them. Last point. The Holocaust is one of the most written about and studied matters of the last 100 years. It is, if you like, the ultimate proof of truth in history, because as you well be aware, there were attempts to deny this truth, beginning, of course, with the Germans, and I say Germans because not all the killers were members of the Nazi Party, beginning with the Germans destroying the actual extermination camps and the concentration camps. It also continued with the repurposing of them. I went about 3 years ago to Sachsenhausen, which was the concentration camp north of Berlin. Does anybody know what happened to that, Sachsenhausen? No. Well, Sachsenhausen in 1945, the new bunch, the communists, used it to lock up people they didn't like, principally socialists, some of whom were Jews, of course, and it went on being used as a concentration camp, not a killing camp, although a fair number of people died there, but it went on being used as a concentration camp right through the late 40s as a result. And actually, if you go there now, the authorities there, who are plagued by neo-Nazis who try and sort of attack it, but the authorities there have the difficult task of working out how much weight to put on the killing of Jews by the Nazis, how much weight to put on the killing of others by the Nazis, because there were others killed there as well, including politicians, socialist politicians, and Allied prisoners of war who they didn't like, and how much weight to put on those who were, well, who died, let's just put it like that, as a result of the brutality of the communist usage. So there is the problem in every sense remains. The Holocaust is quite clearly existed, but the way in which it moves into the attention of people, whether in film, in television, in radio, in family accounts. I was listening once to, because I was just about to be on it, I was listening to LBC, the London Broadcasting Company, which has a radio station, or the major London radio station, and the person before me was saying that the Hitler Youth were just like Boy Scouts. I just thought, you know, I mean, the point is that, because his father had been in the Hitler Youth, okay? The point is that, in other words, people tell family narratives that change the situation. I said that wasn't the case. I came in straight hard and, of course, was ignored. You know, I was treated as being disrespectful of another speaker. Well, you know, good, that's what one should be. The extent to which we are going to be able to sustain an understanding of it beyond academic work into the wider public is more problematic now than was the case 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and 20 years ago. People here in gatherings like this, we obviously don't want to hear that. That goes without saying. We want to believe that scholarship, collective memory is going to be more positive and progressive. America, after all, is a society based on the notion of optimism and improvability, indeed what Passmore called the perfectibility of man. But as far as Holocaust memorialization is concerned, it is the exact opposite at the present day. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeremy, for that wonderful and provocative lecture. How about some Q&A? Yeah, cool. Okay, so here's how it's going to work. If you have your hand up, I'm going to come to you with the microphone, and that way everybody can hear you, okay? Oh, man. I go to my students first, man.
Thanks. Sure. Hi. Thank you so much for that talk. I thought it was very informative and well articulated. I appreciate that, taking a history of Holocaust class right now. So thank you. Going to my question. So subsequent to the Second World War, how did the Jewish question evolve considering widespread decolonization throughout Latin America, Asia, Africa, and just honestly many parts of the world, which included, you know, the toppling of empires, namely Britain, France, Spain, Portugal. In addition to, around the same time that a lot of these countries were decolonizing, there was the concept of the third world. So like through the Bandung Conference and, you know, initiatives like that. And also the increasing polarization between the US and the Soviet Union with the question of, you know, capitalism or communism. So just basically through all of that after the Second World War, how did the Jewish question evolve?
Well, that's an excellent question, and can I congratulate you? It's wonderful to see students asking the first question. So, okay. And if you won't mind, that was a very good question. One minor thing, decolonization in Latin America is the 18 teens and 20s. But other than that, a very good question, okay? I'm afraid to say that Israel did not do terribly well out of decolonization, nor did Jews. Okay? So in 1945, there were very large Jewish minorities in many countries that were colonies. Algeria, for example, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, okay? Iraq, places that were either formally colonies, which was true of the first three, or informally colonies, which was true of the last two. So one of the things that happened is, whether you call it the Jewish question or not, many of these groups found it very necessary to flee because the process of decolonization, unfortunately, was structured around a nationalism, sometimes an invented nationalism, i.e., let's say Morocco, where in practice you've got two nationhoods, Arabs and Berbers. But there was a nationalism from which the Jews were excluded. So you get large and long represented Jewish communities that cease to exist or cease to be consequential or feel it necessary to emigrate. And we're talking here from places that had been multinational or multi-ethnic, if you wish to use that term, that's what I would do, which had not been under German sway. I mean, obviously the Germans enforced through their butchery an end of Jewish participation in multi-ethnicity in places like Salonika or Marseille, both of which have been international cities. But places like Istanbul, where there'd been a lot of Jews in 1920, Alexandria, where there'd been a hell of a lot of Jews in 1940, Algiers, where there'd been a hell of a lot of Jews, these become as Judenfrei as the Führer would have wanted, all right? So that was very unpleasant, and the Jews did not benefit from the end of empire. And I think it's fair to say that many of them became emigres back either to the colonial imperial metropole or to Israel. And the Israeli account, which I think is a reasonable one, is they took all these refugees in. Why the hell didn't the Arab countries do the same? I think that's a reasonable point. As far as the Third World is concerned, partly it's the way in which Israel changes position. This is going to surprise you, or maybe not surprise you, but in 1947, 8, 9, who is arming Israel? Anybody?
The Soviets and the Czechs.
The Soviets and the Czechs, particularly the Czechs, but with Soviet arms coming through the Czechs. France moves into that role in the 50s because France is opposed to Nasser, and they think of the dictator of Egypt, and they see Nasser as threatening their position in Algeria. So France moves into it. But when it was the Soviets, you see, there was this attitude that in some way Israel was a progressive force. Now that, and it's worth bearing in mind that this plays through the same, the British, for example, are, behind conservative Arab states like Jordan. They're not particularly philo-Semitic, all right? Pro-Israel, though they ally with Israel in the 1956 Suez crisis, of course. Now, the situation changes as Israel moves closer to the United States, which it very much does after the Six-Day War. De Gaulle, after the Six-Day War, he already had been fairly critical of Israel, but de Gaulle becomes really anti-Israel, refuses to provide aircraft, which is very important because the basic aircraft, as the gentleman over here said, was Mirage fighters, and suddenly they couldn't get spare parts for them. The Israelis had bought warships from the French. The French wouldn't let them go. In fact, the Israelis famously seized them at Cherbourg and sailed them out and told the French to bugger off. And so the Americans became much more important. And by 1973, in the war then, it is America that is, during the war, actively rearming. I mean, big American transport planes are landing during the war at Ben Gurion Airport and providing, for example, these are enormous planes, providing, for example, whole fighter jets within them. You know, tanks being transported the same way. And I mean, all of that, interestingly enough, at a time when America was in theory neutral. But forget about that. The government, it was one of the more inspired moments of Nixon, really one of his more inspired international relations. Now, by that period, the Third World was very hostile to Israel. The PLO did much better than the Israelis at playing to the non-aligned movement, helped by the fact that it was backed by the Soviets, and they would put a lot of effort into the non-aligned movement to make them pro then, and helped by the fact that at that point the Arabs weren't Islamic fundamentalists. You know, the situation changes after 1979, when if you're a third world secularist, you don't really like the Iranians. But until then, bloody difficult for the Israelis. Sorry, I promised to be shorter the next time. I apologise.
Hi, thank you for being here. This is a very different question. Why do you think the reason is of like the modern anti-Israel, anti-Zionist movements that we see today so readily exploit the Holocaust and kind of like you were mentioning before, have this sort of sense of relativity? Oh, well, what they're doing in Gaza is a Holocaust. What do you think the reason for that is?
Well, I mean, you know, a narrative, a rhetoric. It's a rhetoric. It's not an accurate account. You know, if, for example, Israel, a state with enormous power, had wished to kill the population, it would actually, it was within its military means to do so, but it's not what it's trying to do. But the rhetoric can be powerful irrespective of what you might regard as the accuracy or inaccuracy of it. Now, and in practical terms, the use of the Holocaust as an image to describe the Israelis in Gaza, which is an inaccurate usage, but is politically very potent because it's deliberately used to challenge the Israeli account to a view held in other countries. So that's why it's being used, and it will go on being used. And it will go on, therefore, being a factor in the public debate. There will be a lot of people out there who, for political reasons of their own and politicized reasons of their own, use Holocaust diminishment, which is, you know, calling Gaza Holocaust, which, as I said, isn't, is an aspect of Holocaust diminishment. Good question again. Yeah, any students first? Well, I know all students, all of you are students of history, I know that. And there's another one over there, okay? Norm, you're a student, aren't you? Yeah, that lady next, yeah.
Thank you for being here and giving that talk to us. It was absolutely wonderful. You're talking about the diminishment of the narrative. What aspect do you think contributes the fact that any survivor, whether victims or perpetrators, are pretty much gone? I mean, there's a few still. Yeah. I got to meet one last month. But does it matter, does it make a difference that there are no more witnesses on the other side to continue the narrative?
Yeah, good question. And indeed, in the Times today, the Times of London, I ought to say, so that's tomorrow's Times, because being in the time zone here, I can read it. There is the obituary of Anna Frank's best friend, who was half Jewish and who survived the war. So it's a very good question. Well, first of all, I think it's fair to say that the Holocaust survivors, many of whom were elderly at the time and in very, difficult circumstances, physically and mentally, bore testimony very powerfully to what had happened. So there is the most enormous amount of material in recorded formats, oral and oral as well as visual, there is the most enormous amount of material. So the fact that alas, the people are dead, and quite frankly, you would want people to die. You don't want to live forever. You know, the curse. Actually, for those of you who are interested, the Cumaean Sibyl. Do you remember this story? It's a story from antiquity, retold by the best American poet of the last century. Anybody tell me who the best American poet of the last century was? Dear, dear, dear. Dear, 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 are people that have lost their culture. Come on, who's the best American, the most famous American poet of the last century? T.S. Eliot, okay? In T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, he actually has a reference to the Cumaean Sibyl, which comes from Petronius' Satyricon, it's where the original is. The Sibyl, is, you know, a wise woman, is given by the gods one wish. What's the wish? To live forever. What happens to her? She shrivels into this figure which lives like a really shriveled person in a tiny little cage. Not that she's been imprisoned, but that's the only way she can physically stand up. So you would want, quite frankly, Holocaust survivors to have, you know, to be offered the grace of eventually dying and so on at the end of a full life. If they're dying now, that's the end of a full life. But yes, I think the memory is very clearly there. I think the memory has been disseminated. I think the sources are absolutely tremendous. And as I've said, obviously there are the deniers who are useless and horrible and all the rest of it. The problem is not them, it's the diminishers.
Hi. I wanted to take a step back for a second and go back to the generation right after the war that you talk about kind of had some amnesia about the Holocaust and really wanted to not really discuss it and stuff. I wanted to ask you about the impact of the Nuremberg trials in that type of rhetoric and idea, because I know that is a huge rhetoric that is coming back today, as though, you know, well, we've legally solved this through the Nuremberg trials, and I just wanted to kind of get your opinion on that.
Well, that's a really good question. The Nuremberg trials, in which incidentally the Jewish element was downplayed. It wasn't ignored completely, but it was downplayed. The Nuremberg trials are part of a very immediate post-war moment. I mean, Orson Welles did a film in which, yes, there is mention of the camps, and yes, they are discussed, but that goes very quickly. And of course, it's not helped by the fact that the Western Allies, the camps they get hold of are Buchenwald and Dachau, which are not extermination camps. And it's actually quite difficult in 1947, 8, 9, 50 to persuade people about X number of people having died in Auschwitz too, let alone the Einsatzgruppen. And the reason I first first lectured, which was years ago, I had to do, you know, this sort of, not that we use this phrase in Britain, the Plato to NATO at my university. I said, well, we've got to have one on the Holocaust. You know, I said, we have to have that. So people said, fair enough, you do it. Okay. But the other thing is, I am by background a military historian. And one of the things that amazed me most is how little mention of the Holocaust there was in the military history of World War II. And if you could go back and you could look at, and look, the Brits are just as bad, I'm not knocking the Americans, but you can look at famous American collective dictionaries of military figures, say Dupy, for example, D-U-P-U-Y, on people like Guderian or Rundstedt, both of whom were in command and deliberately signed off instructions for killing Jews. You know, we're talking about the Wehrmacht. No mention of all of that, absolutely no mention. And I decided as a military historian, I ought to write a book about the Holocaust because it was just being ignored by military historians. This was war. You know, it was a very one-sided war, horrifically one-sided war, but this was war. You know, Hitler saw it as a war. This was war against Jews. And I thought a military historian ought, with the particular skills that they had, ought to look at it. Now, this was helped by the fact that in 1994 there was what caused a sensation in Germany, which was an exhibition in Hamburg of photos taken by Wehrmacht soldiers and officers showing other Wehrmacht soldiers and officers slaughtering Jews. And the point was that all of the photos, and there were lots of them, were Wehrmacht, not Waffen-SS, not police battalions, Wehrmacht. This caused an enormous row in Germany because the people who produced the exhibition were accused of being anti-German, etc., etc., etc. But it actually made what I thought was a very powerful point, that the German war effort was more centrally involved in pursuing a broad-based, not just Hitler, but a broad-based process of what I think can fairly be called genocide, and that therefore it ought to be looked at, it oughtn't to be elided, and for a military historian to write a book about it would be an important thing to do. So that was why I wrote the book. Incidentally, this lecture is the first time I've lectured on this particular topic, you know, on the situation past 1945. Yes, madam.
Hello, sir. I just want to thank you for being here and sharing the stage with us at the University of Florida. First and foremost, I agree with you with saying that Holocaust denial and diminishment is disgusting. I'd like to take a step back and discuss the issue of one's modern vocabulary and proper use of words. In a modern world with internet access, social media, and a constant 24-hour news cycle, how can we maintain the precision and the context of the words genocide and Holocaust? How can they be preserved?
Well, that's a very good question again. What good students you have here. That is a very good question. The problem is, yes, that the meaning of language leaches all the time. Absolutely, you're right. And you cannot have a, as it were, pure use of a language. You know, the notion, I don't know if you know Plato's Republic, the idea is that there is a pure source of something, the table, but it was, you know, but we only see the table refracted in an odd light. I mean, I've imaged, I'm not as bright as Plato, but I've imaged history as being like a mirror on the past. The mirror has been smashed and it's rotating slowly in the wind with most of the glass having dropped out. That's what we have, and of course it then becomes very difficult to arrive at an agreed statement. In practice you're never going to have an agreed one, but what you should have is one that is, you know, conceptually, methodologically and morally alert. And I use terms like disgusting. That's a moral term. And a lot of people would say to me, they do say to me, you shouldn't use that kind of emotive language. And I say to them, that is ridiculous. A historian is a public figure. And if you present this simply in a kind of very prissy language, I think you destroy any sense of engagement with the subject. So that would be my argument. By the way, thank you for saying that about Florida. But you know, this reminds me of a visit I made some years ago to the University of Washington. So I go to the University of Washington. I fly all the way from Britain to Seattle. And I spend several days there and, you know, give a few lectures. And then just before I'm due to fly back to Britain, I say to my hosts, there's a complete fraud here, because on all the posters you have an enormous mountain behind Seattle, but you know, there's been total cloud cover. I've not seen this mountain, it clearly doesn't exist. So obviously, I mean, this man brought me here under the promise of, you know, swimming with dolphins and wonderful, you know, wonderful, and look, I come over here and discover I'm in Britain again. No, actually, no, actually this is nicer, much nicer. Sorry, yeah. I apologize. Other questions?
Thanks for coming. It's very informative. Seems impossible to kind of relitigate the past. It's so complicated. We can learn from it, but very difficult to arrive at what's just. What are, in your opinion, the guiding first principles of contextualizing the conversations? What are the guiding first principles? You've referenced truth, you've referenced morals. I don't know if those are the guiding first principles, but what are they?
Okay, all I can give you is my view. Okay, I'm not, you know, I haven't come down from Mount Sinai with a list of tablets saying this is it, chaps. and ladies, of course. The chaps of both sexes, or all sexes, or whatever we are supposed to be in these days. As an academic, I believe that what is important is to encourage people to take part in informed debate. Okay? And by informed debate, I don't mean that everybody has to have the same amount of information. What I mean is a willingness to engage with the ideas that are there. And as far as history is concerned, and history is not the most important subject, it's just the one I know about, okay? As far as history is concerned, you could set the same question. I went into one of your classes this morning, I think I said that this morning. You could set the same question to people who are 16, 18, 20, or our age as academics. And what you would be expecting is not different facts. What you'd be expecting is differing ability to handle the ideas. So what am I looking for? Conceptualization, the willingness to understand what concepts like causation mean. And that there's no correct answer. Then methodology, the willingness to understand how you engage in interrogating the evidence. Okay? And lastly, I think historiography. It is important to know why people have come to a different account of the past. And I'll give you here as a closing moment the most memorable lecture I ever went to. It wasn't one I gave. The most memorable lecture I ever gave for me was I was invited to Honolulu to lecture on why the Allies won World War II and do it on the deck of the Missouri. And I was told to stop at 6 o'clock for a gap because they play the last post and then to go on again. That was very memorable. But the most memorable lecture I ever went to was when I was an undergraduate. So this is many, many, many years ago. And I was taken to the Moral Sciences Club, which is what Cambridge calls the Philosophy Society, okay? And I remember the occasion. It was one of the only 2 times in my life I smoked a cigarette, all right? The occasion was that it was being given by somebody that had broken the glass ceiling, Elizabeth Anscombe, very, very famous philosopher, who was sitting there smoking a full-length Havana with a monocle and wearing the gown of her most famous male chum, shall we say, Wittgenstein, all right? And she set us a problem. And the problem is an interesting one. She set us a problem. You drive home at the end of the day. You park your car outside the locked garage, on the drive. And during the night, the door is never opened, okay? But in the morning, somehow, the molecules of the car have rearranged themselves or been rearranged, and the car is in the garage. She then set us the question, why would a historian and a scientist produce a different explanation of that? Now, we haven't got time now to go into it, but what she was trying to get us to do is what I've always tried to do in teaching, which is to get people to think. You're all intelligent, you're all clever. You wouldn't be here otherwise, all right? But most people don't use their minds. For a whole host of reasons, because we tend, I'm just as bad as everybody else. We tend to think in terms of building blocks that are substitutes for complicated arguments. We don't tend to want to contextualize things. We don't want to ask difficult questions about what we believe in and why we believe it. So the question today is a difficult one. I wasn't saying, did the Holocaust happen? That would be an easy lecture. The answer is yes. I wasn't lecturing on why did the Third Reich do this, which again is a relatively easy question. There's a massive literature, you can offer the differing interpretations and then you can suggest why you think one is more apposite than another, all right? I'm not doing that. I'm doing a much more difficult thing, which is asking you to come with me in an exploration of why do people's attitudes towards it change? And there is no obvious answer for that. I've tried to offer you some because you're intelligent and because I wanted to offer something which I thought you'd never heard before. And I'd like this to be value added. But I don't know the answers. But the point is to generate you to think about it, and that's the great advantage of history as a subject. There is not a, as it were, 6 + 6 = 12 account. There is, shot through with history, is the fact we cannot recall the past. I mean, very briefly, Elizabeth Anscombe answered, this is very briefly, it was an hour of really high point thing. Anscombe argued that a scientist would say that this hadn't happened unless you could repeat it under laboratory conditions, whereas a historian would say, well, it had happened, we can't explain it, but it had happened. That is very simply what she said. I mean, it goes on, it was much more complicated than that, but that is what I'm trying to do. And I think that's what we ought to do. You're informed citizens. You will have different views on all sorts of things. One of the great values of talking about the kind of subjects we're talking about is to help people realise why they disagree and to try and help them realise what they should be looking for, in my view, but they may have a different view, in terms of trying to discuss these disagreements. So it's a moral purpose. That's moral. You know, very funny this, isn't it? I'm a moral person. I wouldn't have believed it myself, but there you go.
Unfortunately, we could go on for a while, but they're here to pack up the room, and so,
Oh, right, okay.
and so we're being evicted a little bit. But I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank you for your very thoughtful questions, and I'd like to thank Dr. Jeremy Black for a wonderful evening lecture.
Thank you. And can I just say, there are two old friends who I've known for many, many, many years here, Mike Leger and Norm. I'd like to say how nice and pleased I am by the occasion here. When you're my age, you don't go to places unless you want to see people, unless you want to be there. Everything I wanted has been more than fulfilled, and I very much hope to have the opportunity, if I'm invited, to come back again. Thank you.
You told me you wanted to see the dolphins. But,
Actually, I'll tell you a funny story. A friend of mine did go to swim with the dolphins. He was a doctor. He was here on some medical conference. He said, actually, what was really nice was not swimming with the dolphins. It was swimming with the dolphin ladies, in other words. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Oh.